Bush and Cheney told us Saddam bought aluminum tubes to refine uranium. False. They told us he purchased yellow cake in Niger. False. They told us Iraqi intelligence officers had a meeting with Osama bin Laden. False. They told us the Iraqi army was operating mobile laboratories for biological warfare. False. They fired generals in the Pentagon for disagreeing with them. This made the remaining generals paranoid, fearful of losing their pensions. The generals cooperated, but leadership morale declined. The Pentagon could no longer trust the president. The generals went into Iraq knowing the battlefield was tilted against them. Rumsfeld's invasion plan was naive and incomplete. It did not contain line items to seize the banks and museums, so all the antiquities of Babylon were looted to finance the insurgency, and 4 vaults were blown open and emptied. Oddly, there was no line item to seize and secure the armories. Where would you store WMD warheads except in an armory? And weeks after the invasion, soldiers of 4th Infantry passing an armory in trucks saw civilians loading objects out of an armory into white Toyota pickup trucks. The objects were artillery shells, mortar rounds, landmines, the IEDs of the next 4 years. It says here we don't negotiate with terrorists, but Mr. Bremer negotiated with insurgents, trying to buy them off. The insurgents were Muslims, Mr. Bremer was not, so they defrauded him and laughed at him. Under the Muslim code of Khudna, under the laws of Islam, any Muslim is allowed to defraud anyone who is not a Muslim. So they took Bremer's money and continued their insurgency, shooting GIs, with the ammunition purchased by the money handed to them by Mr. Bremer. $8.8 billion was handed out, and no written record exists of the transactions for which it was paid. Mr. Bremer claims he was jump-starting the Iraq economy. Yeah, the Iraq economy looks like it was jump-started. Bush gave Bremer the Medal of Freedom to convince the lame and the halt that he had done some kind of a job. He did some kind of a job, all right. Bush and Cheney both knew we were never going to find any WMD, so they pushed the generals to get information on Al-Qaeda from the prisoners in Abu Ghraib. By this time, Pentagon officers know they'll be fired if they disagree with anything, so they safeguard their careers by not mentioning that torture of Muslim prisoners is forbidden by Islam, and forbidden by the Geneva Convention as well. So the idea was born to hire Arabs through a private defense contractor, and these civilian experts would question Iraqi prisoners using traditional methods. But the Arab civilian interrogators now had something they didn't know how to use. They had status. They were employed by the highest levels of the Pentagon. They had a secret mission. They had a security clearance. And they were authorized to beat the crap out of anyone they didn't like. Folks, in the Muslim world, that's better than a black Mercedes and a sexy girlfriend. So the civilian interrogators hung with the officers of the reserve police unit at Abu Ghraib, and nobody questioned their tactics. Everyone cooperated with these high-status civilians from the Pentagon, and when enlisted guards were told to take pictures of naked prisoners on the floor, Bush and Cheney did not want the scandal traced back to them, so they had to protect the generals who had designed the program and hired the interrogators. The generals realized every young officer who pulled Officer of the Day duty had been told to ignore any unusual activities he saw. This is because the OD is required by the UCMJ to halt any illegal activities he sees during his rounds. So the written reports of the Officer of the Day have all been destroyed. All the Army had to do was prosecute the enlisted men for following orders. Young men all over the country saw this, and enlistments in the Army dropped 16%. Our thoroughly botched invasion of Iraq has taught the Muslim world 2 things about us. First, our fearless leaders don't understand the first thing about Muslims. Second, Our army is repeating the errors of Vietnam, which means Muslims can wear us down by copying the tactics of the Viet Cong. The Hearts and Minds initiatives of Osama bin Laden have been much more successful than ours. As a result, 70% of the Muslim world disapprove of the United States and approve of bin Laden's attack on the United States. Because Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Bremer refused to allow the generals, the French, and the British to tell them about Muslims, the number of enemies we are fighting went from about 10,000 fanatics to about 100 million easily manipulated paranoids and sociopaths, easily converted from Muslim in the street to mad bomber in the course of a few prayer meetings. We must have some success in Iraq to demonstrate to the enormous population of enemies we now have in the Muslim world that our failures of the past few years are not evidence that we are a decadent and weak society. Muslims respond to weakness. Muslims attack the weak, and bad leadership is weakness. First, we should neutralize Bush and Cheney. These two guys are like a reverse King Midas. Everything they touch turns to crap. If we need a legal reason to remove them, they have defrauded the United States, resulting in the death of 3,200 plus of our best young people. They have put the United States into the greatest debt in our economic history at a time when our economy is grossly unbalanced, to fight a war which accomplished nothing. They appointed a governor they neglected to train to negotiate relations with the Iraqi people which they neglected to manage. They granted habeas corpus to the entire nation of Iraq before the borders were secure, before the firearms were collected, before the hostilities had stopped. We must build a committee of senators and congressmen with both military and intelligence expertise and require that committee to establish an overall strategy for a positive conclusion to this Iraq disaster. The committee would set goals for and supervise the performance of military forces, CIA, SA, and supervise any budget for reconstruction of Iraq, making expenditures for reconstruction conditional on the achievement of permanent peace accords between the tribes and government, between insurgent Sunni and government, between Shia militia and government, and between prominent Sunni and Shia clerics. All the leaders of Iraq society must accept, in written agreement with other Muslims, a share of responsibility in maintaining peace and in preventing violence. United States should never be signatory to these accords and should never provide monies to encourage any party to sign. If the Iraqi people and government cannot be reasoned with, here is my suggestion. We secure the northern three provinces of Iraq to protect both our Kurdish friends and our Turkish friends from each other. And we make ourselves available to the Iraqi government to perform military strikes against Al-Qaeda or any insurgent group identified by the Iraqi government. We must stop kicking in doors. A non-Muslim soldier who enters a Muslim house is considered unclean, insulting, and hostile, even if he is polite and doesn't shoot anyone. Worst of all, this house-to-house search for bad guys is a repetition of the bad tactics of Vietnam. We are repeating a tactic of searching and burning hooches that worked against us 40 years ago. It worked against Israelis during the Intifada. By kicking in doors, intimidating kids and women with guns, we are converting moderates and teenagers into insurgent volunteers and helpers. U.S. military forces, for as long as they remain in Iraq, should wait for Iraqi government or Iraqi people to come to them with intelligence. They should keep a low profile. They should patrol only to interdict attacks and ambushes against them. They should never divide their patrols. They should wait for a Muslim to turn in the bad guys and always, always, always be aware that any Muslim might be leading you into an ambush, even if only to save his own family from kidnapping and execution. My name is Quixote. There's more than one way to skin a cat.